Reed Morgan wasn't used to being cornered, least of all by his oldest friend. But that night, high above Manhattan with music pulsing and egos clashing beneath strings of light, Jack Weston managed to pull it off. It started as a joke, the kind of careless dare two bored rich men throw out between glasses of overpriced champagne. But there was a glint in Jack's eye, half smug, half serious, that Reed didn't miss. The kind that didn't fade. "You talk about control like you invented it," Jack said, swirling his drink with the ease of someone who didn't need to prove a thing. "Let's see if you can handle something that doesn't come pre-approved with a pedigree and a modeling contract." The bait had been dangled, the trap already set. Reed tilted his head, only half listening, until Jack made it real. $1 million. 6 months. You marry someone totally outside your type. Not an accessory. Not an easy win. Someone who won't fall in line. That was the moment. The room around him could have caught fire and Reed wouldn't have blinked. He didn't need the money, but he needed the win. That was how he operated. Nothing was ever about what it appeared to be. He didn't ask for details. Didn't request a name. Didn't laugh it off or walk away. Reed smiled with the kind of confidence that had crushed boardrooms and closed billion-dollar deals. Jack just smirked and said her name like it was a final move in a chess match. Erin Walker. The name meant nothing to Reed. No face came to mind. That was the point. She wasn't from the circles he moved in. She didn't grace the covers of fashion magazines or sit front row at art shows. Jack said she was smart, stubborn, worked in nonprofit education. Independent in the way that couldn't be bought or dressed up. Not interested in climbing ladders, she didn't build herself. "She's not going to fall for your usual tricks," Jack added, tossing back the last of his drink. "That's why she's perfect." Reed didn't flinch. Challenges like this were fuel. He'd built an empire on taking what wasn't meant for him. He never asked if he should, only how soon he could. By the next morning, his assistant had the basic details. Erin Walker, 31, lives in Brooklyn, master's degree, works for an education nonprofit that helps underfunded public schools. No scandal, no red carpet appearances, no public weaknesses, nothing on the surface that he could exploit. But Reed didn't panic. He never did. People, even the most principled ones, had pressure points. He just needed to find hers. What he didn't expect was her willingness to meet. She didn't seem curious, didn't act impressed or skeptical. She simply said yes to the meeting as if she'd already weighed everything and made peace with it. Reed assumed she'd play hard to get. Instead, she came in like someone who had her own reasons for stepping into the fire. He saw her file, just a glance, but enough to know she was competent, disciplined, not afraid to make tough calls. She wasn't predictable, and that annoyed him more than he let on. Women usually came in two types in Reed's world: easy wins or easy distractions. Erin looked like neither. When the day of their meeting arrived, she chose a time, not a place. Let him pick the setting. Reed booked a restaurant that screamed exclusivity and influence. The kind of place where his name didn't need a reservation. He waited to see how she'd react. She didn't flinch. She didn't compliment the ambiance or get wide-eyed at the clientele. She sat down like she had a clock running somewhere in her head. Told him she knew about the bet. Every detail. The money, the conditions, the timeline. Said it flat, like it was a business transaction she'd already reviewed. That threw him. Still, he stayed calm. He always did. He asked why she agreed to it. She said she had her own reasons. She didn't elaborate, just left it there, dangling like a loose thread Reed instinctively wanted to pull. He hated not knowing motives. It made people hard to predict. He liked leverage. She came with none. Or maybe she came with all of it. Erin told him up front. She didn't want his money, didn't care about the lifestyle. She had her job, her space, her identity. The 6 months would come and go. Nothing would change for her. Reed could play his part, she'd play hers, and when the time came, they'd walk away clean. Reed agreed, not because he believed her, but because he didn't believe she'd last. He thought she was bluffing. Everyone had a price, and he had enough money to name it. But as she stood up to leave, he couldn't shake the feeling that he hadn't just signed up for a bet. He'd stepped into something much bigger. He just didn't know what yet. All he knew was that the game had started, and for the first time in a long time, Reed Morgan wasn't sure he'd already won. The wedding happened fast. No family, no press, no vows beyond the bare minimum. Just signatures, paperwork, and a quiet agreement that neither one of them cared to celebrate. It was cold by design, functional like an acquisition deal. Reed didn't want warmth. He wanted control. 6 months, that was the number. He repeated it to himself like a mantra. After the ceremony, he took Erin to the penthouse. He expected questions, some reaction, maybe a reluctant appreciation for the luxury. Nothing came. She looked around once, offered no opinion, and simply asked which room was hers. Reed told her she could have whatever space she wanted. She chose the guest bedroom without pause. He thought that was the beginning of the game. In his mind, the clock had started ticking, and now he could start winning. He brought gifts, jewelry, designer shoes, silk robes in colors she hadn't asked for. He left them in boxes on her bed. None were opened. He booked trips to Milan and Santorini, forwarded her the itineraries, and left 2 tickets on the kitchen counter. She never brought them up. She made her own coffee in the morning and read reports from her nonprofit while he checked stock tickers. There were no confrontations, just silence and refusal. Reed was used to resistance. But this wasn't that. This was dismissal, like he didn't exist in her world, even while living under the same roof. 3 weeks in, he told her she didn't need to keep working. "You're married now," he said, voice light, just floating the idea. She didn't answer, just left the room. The next day, she submitted a grant proposal before breakfast and left for the office. That's when Reed started changing tactics. He booked her schedule without asking. Meetings for lunch, gallery openings, brunches with his contacts' wives. She ignored the invites. He called her employer, offered a massive donation in her name. She returned the check. The nonprofit posted a thank you message, then refunded the money publicly. She had her own spine. That part became clear. Still, Reed couldn't stop himself. He started interfering more directly. When she planned an education summit in Queens, he arranged for the venue to have technical issues the day before. He offered a private location in Midtown, under his name, fully catered, complete with press coverage. She canceled the event entirely instead of accepting. She kept walking away from every hand he extended, even the hands that looked like help. He wasn't used to that. Erin didn't play defense. She played a different game entirely. She didn't escalate. She didn't react. She absorbed. And that, more than any retaliation, got under his skin. Reed began to unravel in small ways. He wanted to crack her. He needed to prove to himself that he could. The tension was constant, sharp but quiet. They passed each other like diplomats at war. Every word weighed, every glance calculated. She didn't argue. She didn't accuse, but she never folded. At dinner, they sat at opposite ends of a long table and said nothing. Reed tried small talk. Erin responded with facts. He offered wine. She drank water. He commented on the market. She talked about public school funding. The lines weren't just drawn, they were fortified. One night, he asked why she was really doing this. She paused, looked at him the way someone does when they're deciding whether the other person even deserves the truth, then answered with a line he couldn't shake for days. "Because 6 months is longer than it looks, and I've got time." It wasn't threatening. It wasn't warm. It was just real. He thought he could chip away at her with pressure. But every act of dominance turned into an echo. It bounced off her and came back at him as silence. And that silence screamed. He started noticing the small things. She didn't spend his money. She didn't use his name. When people asked about her new last name, she corrected them. She kept her calendar private. She cooked her own meals. She never invited anyone over. She lived like she wasn't married at all. Reed began losing his grip, not just on her, but on the story he was telling himself. That this was still a bet. That this was still winnable. That she was a person to be worn down, not someone who might actually be reshaping him without even trying. He spent nights wondering if she even hated him. Because hatred, at least, was engagement. But Erin gave him indifference. And indifference had no cracks to slip through. He considered calling Jack, just to say something, to admit that maybe the joke had gone too far. But he didn't, because saying it out loud would make it real. And Reed wasn't ready to admit that. For the first time in his life, he was stuck in a game he didn't know how to win. He doubled down. He started showing up at her office unannounced, left flowers. Erin gave them to her interns. He tried making dinners. She rescheduled her evenings. Every attempt to draw her in became a record of his own futility. He told himself it didn't matter, that the goal was still the same, 6 months. Outlast her. Keep the deal. Walk away richer. But by the end of the second month, Reed Morgan wasn't thinking about the money anymore. He was thinking about her, about why she hadn't cracked, about why she walked through his world like it couldn't touch her, about what made someone say yes to marrying a man she clearly didn't respect and still hold her ground like she was the one in charge. Whatever this had started as, it wasn't a bet anymore. It was something else. And Reed knew, though he couldn't admit it yet, that he was no longer the player in this game. He was the one being played. Reed stopped pretending this was fun by the start of the third month. He had exhausted every tactic in his arsenal. Coercion wrapped in charm, sabotage masked as concern, even silence used like a blade. Erin had responded to each one with the same steady, infuriating neutrality. She didn't rise to the bait. She didn't react with anger. She simply outlasted him every single day. That's when he tried something different. Emotion. One night, after she canceled on yet another engagement he'd arranged, he confronted her, not with accusations, but confusion. He asked what she wanted, told her he didn't understand her. Any other woman would have been thrilled, he said. The penthouse, the gifts, the lifestyle. He meant it as a question, but it came out like a confession. A man lost in the middle of a plan that was no longer his. Erin gave him an answer he wasn't ready for. She didn't want luxury. She wanted respect. And Reed, despite everything he owned, didn't have the currency for that. It stung, more than he cared to admit. Not because she was wrong, but because he'd started to feel something that went beyond irritation or obsession. He had no name for it, only the knowledge that it tightened in his chest every time he failed to get a reaction. Not just because she wouldn't bend, but because she saw right through him. That clarity didn't inspire him to stop. It made him escalate. He cut off her connections, quietly, one by one. Emails stopped getting replies, calls were rerouted, invitations to her education panels were lost in scheduling black holes. He redirected attention, closed doors, pulled strings behind the scenes to make her life more difficult, just enough to create friction, not enough to leave fingerprints. She didn't confront him, she adjusted. He saw her shift plans, reschedule with different venues, redirect communications through new channels. Her response wasn't retaliation. It was adaptation. And Reed realized that was worse. He started losing sleep. Not because of guilt, but because of frustration. He'd built his empire by dismantling resistance. But here she was, not resisting, simply existing beyond his reach. And that, more than any argument or rebellion, pushed him to the edge. Then came the night she told him the truth. He didn't expect it. He hadn't earned it. It came without warning, delivered in a voice that held no drama, only certainty. She knew who he was before they ever met. She knew the damage he'd done. Years ago, her father ran a small company struggling to stay alive. Reed crushed it in a merger that made him millions. To Reed, it was Tuesday. To Erin's family, it was the beginning of an ending. Her father lost everything, his business, his health, eventually his will to live. Erin lost him to suicide the following year. And Reed hadn't remembered, not the company, not the name, not the man. But she had. She'd remembered every headline, every earnings call, every investor quote that praised Reed for his ruthless brilliance. She didn't stop there. Erin told him she'd been pregnant, that the collapse of her father's world became her own, that the grief, the chaos, the unraveling of everything stable pushed her to the brink. She lost the baby before she could tell anyone. Reed didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stood there, absorbing the weight of something too big to rationalize, too far gone to fix. She looked at him like someone watching a clock finally strike. That was the night the bet died. It didn't matter anymore. The $1 million, the 6 months, none of it had been real, not in the way Erin's reasons had been. She had entered this not to win, not to punish, but to reveal. And now Reed was looking at the truth of himself through her eyes, not as a tycoon, not as a strategist, but as a man who had taken things he couldn't even remember and left ruins in places he'd never visit. Erin didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply delivered the facts like closing arguments. Her presence didn't need volume. It carried its own authority. Reed tried to speak, but there was nothing to say. What do you offer someone whose life you helped unravel? What apology could even begin to register? She told him this wasn't about revenge. She didn't want to destroy him. She wanted him to carry the weight. to live in the awareness of what he'd done, to feel the slow, cold consequence of being seen, not as a genius, not as a success story, but as the villain in someone else's tragedy. Then she walked away, not out the door, but into the silence of their shared space, leaving Reed alone with everything she'd said and everything he hadn't known about himself. In the days that followed, she treated him like air. The woman who had once shared plans over coffee and stood with purpose in his penthouse now passed him like he wasn't there. No anger, just absence. And Reed, who had built a life on being unavoidable, now found himself invisible. He tried to fix things, but every word fell flat. He tried to ask questions, but she answered with silence. She wasn't punishing him. She was proving that he didn't matter. Not anymore. He started doubting himself, truly doubting, for the first time in years. Not just as a man, but as a human being. He wasn't the architect of a clever plan anymore. He was the wreckage. And Erin, quiet and immovable, was no longer the bet. She was the verdict. Reed stopped trying to speak. The silence between them had changed. It was no longer tension. It was absence. Erin moved through the apartment like he didn't live there, like his existence was a background hum easily ignored. She answered questions with nods, never asked any in return. When she cooked, she made enough for one. When he entered a room, she left another. It wasn't punishment. It was erasure. He thought, for a time, that the worst part was the guilt. But it wasn't. The worst part was realizing he didn't matter in her world anymore. And that maybe he never had. She didn't retaliate like he expected. She didn't break things, expose him, or threaten to walk away. She simply stopped including him in her orbit. Even when he tried to apologize, Erin didn't interrupt. She waited for him to finish, then continued whatever she was doing, as if nothing had been said. That quiet refusal to engage cut deeper than any confrontation. At work, things began to slip. Meetings he scheduled were moved without notice. Partners he trusted started questioning his judgment. Proposals stalled. Projects faltered. Reed knew she wasn't sabotaging him in any visible way, but the pressure followed him like fog. He lost clarity. He lost rhythm. He lost control. Home offered no escape. Erin made herself small and enormous all at once. Her silence filled the space, made the walls press in. She still occupied the guest room, still cooked her own meals, still left the penthouse each morning in crisp, unbothered calm. Reed started unraveling by inches. One evening, he found her reading on the couch. Nothing dramatic, just a book. Something about the scene made him stop. He sat across from her, unsure what he was hoping to find. He started speaking, slowly, sincerely, desperate for something more than silence. He told her he knew he'd hurt her, that he hadn't understood the depth of what he'd taken, that he was sorry. Not for the game, but for forgetting people like her father even existed. She closed the book and looked at him. Then she asked, without venom, without emphasis, if he truly believed anything he could say would bring her father back, would undo the years she and her mother scraped by, would erase the choices she'd made just to survive, would return the child she lost to stress, shame, and exhaustion. He had no answer, because there wasn't one. She said that whatever he did now wasn't for her, it was for him, and that he'd carry this forever. Not because she needed him to, but because truth had weight, and now it was his. From that night forward, Erin didn't simply ignore him. She dismantled him, subtly, deliberately. She removed his comfort, not in grand gestures, but in small, precise acts. She rerouted deliveries. She locked him out of systems she used to manage for him. She shifted the housekeeper's hours, the doorman's alerts, the grocery lists. Reed never found his things where he left them. The home he had curated now refused to bend to him. At work, the unraveling accelerated. Emails leaked. Proposals were undercut. The board began holding meetings without him. Investors hesitated. Public statements didn't align with internal strategies. Reed didn't have proof, but he felt the pull of invisible strings. His empire, the one he had built with charm and precision, began slipping beneath his feet. Erin watched, not with glee, not even satisfaction, just with presence, a quiet, impossible kind of clarity, the kind that didn't celebrate revenge but executed it like an accountant closing a book. He couldn't fight her. She didn't fight back. She let gravity do the work. One night, Reed returned home late from a crumbling investor dinner. The apartment was dark except for the balcony light. Erin was out there, alone, phone in hand, laughing. Not big, not fake. just laughing. And that laugh shattered him. He realized she wasn't surviving him anymore. She was already beyond him. He waited until she hung up, then stepped into the room like a man on trial, his voice low and nearly gone. He told her she was tearing his life apart. Not just the marriage, not just his name, but everything. She looked at him and said she hadn't touched his fortune, hadn't burned his empire. That would have been too easy. She wanted him to feel the slow collapse, wanted him to wake up every day and taste what it felt like to be powerless. She wasn't here to destroy him. She was here to mirror him. Reed stood still, the words landing like truth always does, without grace. He realized he had always seen people as obstacles or opportunities. Erin had refused to be either. She had become something else entirely, a consequence. She didn't ask for anything. No closure, no apology, no submission. She simply continued. In the weeks that followed, Reed became a ghost in his own life. He stopped speaking at meetings, stopped defending his choices. His name lost its weight. His calendar filled with absences. His presence no longer inspired attention, only discomfort. At home, Erin remained, not a threat, not a storm, just a constant reminder. She had once been a stranger in his world. Now, she was the architect of his reckoning. And Reed, once the man who believed he could shape anything, had become the thing being shaped. He knew deep down that this wasn't over, but it would never go back. Whatever power he once held had been dismantled. Not with fury, not with scandal, but with precision. And Erin, she was still counting days, but not toward an ending, toward something else entirely. Reed stopped trying to recover his old life. The illusion that he could return to what he once was had been stripped away. Erin had taken nothing material, but everything meaningful. Each day in the penthouse passed like a sentence. He moved through his routines mechanically, knowing they didn't belong to him anymore. The empire he had curated was now a mausoleum, and he was its lone keeper. She didn't gloat. She didn't rage. She just moved through each morning like she didn't need to remember he existed. Reed tried again. Flowers, books he saw her reading, playlists curated from her background noise, but it was always the same. A silence too sharp to break. When he left her a handwritten note once, it remained unopened on the table for 3 days until she tossed it in the trash. Not torn, not shredded, just discarded, as if the words inside were predictable, irrelevant. He began to unravel under the weight of invisibility. Reed had built his identity around being seen, admired, envied, obeyed. But now he was the wallpaper in her world, something that used to matter, now just a backdrop. The worst part was that she never had to say a word. Her presence did the work. She attended to her nonprofit with the same unwavering discipline. She hosted virtual meetings from the guest room, rejected interviews, declined press. She stayed grounded while Reed's world quietly collapsed. Every time he crossed paths with her, he braced for confrontation, but she offered only indifference, and it hollowed him out. Then came the confirmation. Reed overheard her late-night phone call. She was talking to someone, casual, calm, and laughing. The topic wasn't innocent. She mentioned Reed's business, his missteps, and the way his reputation had started to rot. It wasn't boastful. It was precise, strategic. There was no doubt left. Erin wasn't just letting him fall. She was ensuring he stayed down. He confronted her the next morning, not with rage, but wariness, accused her of tearing his life apart, told her she was orchestrating his downfall. She looked at him without flinching and said she wasn't ruining anything. She was simply giving back what had been handed to her, slow, relentless loss. She didn't want him bankrupt. That would be too simple. She wanted him to feel what it meant to watch something you built disappear, piece by piece, while everyone else watched you try to hold it together. He didn't speak again. He didn't have to. The message had been delivered, and Erin had no intention of repeating it. She had turned silence into her sharpest weapon, and she wielded it effortlessly. At work, his name lost weight. People started referring to him in the past tense. Deals slipped away. Staff resigned. Investors stopped returning his calls. The company's board reorganized itself quietly, and when Reed tried to assert authority, he found himself met with tight smiles and redirected questions. No one wanted to say it out loud, but it was already true. He was being phased out. At home, Erin began to shift the environment further. She didn't just ignore him. She removed him. She adjusted routines so they never intersected. She erased his presence without ever touching his things. She reclaimed the penthouse in small, intentional ways. Reed would enter a room and feel like an outsider. It was a slow, almost elegant erasure. He tried again to speak, asked her, genuinely, for the first time, if anything could be salvaged, if there was a version of this story where he wasn't just a villain doomed to watch himself fall apart. Erin didn't answer right away. She let him sit in the silence until it became unbearable. Then, without emotion, she said what he needed to hear least. "You took something from me that I can never get back," she said. "Now I'm returning the favor." It was the most honest thing she'd said since the night she told him everything. And Reed understood then that there was no reversal, no redemption arc waiting in the wings, no miracle confession that could undo the damage. Erin didn't want him dead. She wanted him aware. That knowledge sat inside him like a stone, heavy, immovable. He tried, in the days that followed, to act differently. He stayed quiet, stayed out of her way. He prepared breakfast once, not as a grand gesture, just a habit from a former life, something human to do. She didn't acknowledge it. She took her coffee and left the apartment within minutes. At night, he watched her work under soft light, eyes fixed on screens he no longer had access to. She had become someone larger than the woman he met that first night. She had grown inside her grief, sharpened it into intention. And he had shrunk. He caught himself wondering when the 6 months would be over, when the terms of the bet would expire, when the game would end. But there was no game anymore. There was only what remained, the empire, the silence, the weight, and Erin, whose presence no longer felt like revenge, but something deeper, something unyielding. She wasn't here to hurt him. She was here to outlive him. Not in years, in memory. And Reed, for the first time, understood what that meant. Reed stopped trying to explain himself. He had spoken every variation of apology he could manufacture, rewritten the same regrets in different packaging, and still nothing changed. Erin didn't flinch, didn't fold, didn't forgive. She had hardened into something untouchable, a fortress built from everything he once dismissed as weakness. And she was winning, not through confrontation, but through consistency. But the silence didn't stay still. Something inside Reed shifted. Not out of strategy, not out of desperation, out of necessity. He began to see himself for what he was, a man who had never needed to listen because power had always spoken louder. But now, his words meant nothing. Erin had proved that. If he wanted to matter again, it wouldn't be through speeches. It would have to be through change. He didn't announce anything. He didn't tell her he was trying. He just started watching. Not her, but the way she lived, what she valued, what she refused, what she tolerated. He paid attention to the smallest things. The way she drank her coffee, strong, never sweet. The kind of flowers she kept, peonies, always white. The rhythm of her mornings. The hours she worked. The books she left open. The ones she returned unfinished. He didn't interrupt. He adjusted. The first gesture was simple, a bouquet left on the kitchen counter. No card, no note, just the flowers. He stayed in his room that morning, listened to her return from a walk, heard the soft drag of her footsteps stop. No words, no comment. But the flowers were moved, not to the trash, not ignored, just relocated to a side table in the living room. That was enough. The next morning, he made her coffee. Left it exactly how she drank it. No message, no attempt at conversation. She drank it. Didn't thank him. But didn't pour it out either. That was the beginning. He started building a rhythm around her. Not because he needed to win her back, but because, for once, he wanted to do something that wasn't about himself. He began making space without being asked. Prepared breakfast. Restocked the fridge with things she actually ate. Cleared his schedule without announcing it. Made himself smaller in a home he used to dominate. He didn't expect forgiveness. That wasn't the goal anymore. He just wanted to be someone who paid attention, someone who could carry the weight without complaint. And Erin, without saying it, noticed. She didn't smile, she didn't soften, but she didn't push him away like before. She started sitting in the same room longer. She left the kitchen door open when she brewed tea. She didn't pause conversations when he entered. It was a shift too subtle to measure, but unmistakable. Then one evening, something changed. Reed was dressed to leave, a meeting, one of the few he still attended, more out of obligation than relevance. Erin entered the room, stopped him with a sentence so simple it knocked the air out of him. Can you cancel? She didn't explain why. Didn't ask twice. Just looked at him and waited. He nodded. Canceled. No hesitation. And she didn't thank him. She sat on the couch, picked up a book, and gestured quietly at the space beside her. Not an invitation, an opening. They didn't talk about the past. They didn't dissect the silence. They talked about books, about mundane things, about her nonprofit, about a student she was mentoring. It wasn't deep. It wasn't heavy, but it was real. That night, Reed slept for the first time in weeks. The next few days followed the same rhythm. They didn't become a couple. They didn't reclaim the idea of marriage, but they found a shared space, neutral, unforced, real. Erin didn't pretend to forget. She still moved cautiously, still watched him like someone who'd learned the cost of trust. But she didn't shut him out completely. One night, standing on the balcony with a blanket draped around her shoulders, she accepted a cup of tea he handed her. They stood side by side, looking at the skyline, not speaking. And when she finally did, her voice wasn't sharp. It was steady. Why are you doing this? He didn't have a rehearsed answer, just told her the truth. Because I know my words don't mean anything. But I'm trying to show you that I see it now. All of it. And I want to be different. She didn't respond right away, but she stayed, finished her tea, let the silence settle between them like something shared, not something endured. Reed didn't let the progress confuse him. He didn't imagine redemption was near. He knew this was the slowest kind of rebuilding, one made of quiet mornings and unspoken grace. He kept showing up, not loudly, not proudly, just consistently. He cleaned without being asked. He left her space when she needed it. He listened when she spoke. He never filled silence unless she wanted it broken. He kept doing the little things, the coffee, the flowers, the warmth, all without expectation. And Erin responded with patience, not forgiveness, not affection, but patience. She let the space between them breathe. Then one morning, as he was preparing breakfast, she entered the room and asked if he had any plans that evening. He didn't. Let's stay in, she said. Maybe watch something. That was it. No milestone, no declaration, just a moment that didn't feel forced. He nodded, didn't ask for more. He knew now that the road ahead wasn't about reaching a finish line. It was about staying in the process, about showing up every day and earning back something that had never belonged to him in the first place. And Erin? She didn't let him in, not yet, but she hadn't locked the door either. The weeks passed quietly, not with peace, but with possibility. Erin still moved cautiously, still carried her boundaries like armor. But something in the atmosphere had changed. The silence between them no longer felt like exile. It had softened into something else, still sharp at the edges, but capable of holding space. Reed kept his pace steady. He didn't push for answers, didn't ask for closure. He cooked, cleaned, offered tea when the nights turned cold. She accepted it. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they didn't. But each moment felt less like a transaction, more like a tentative step across the fault line between them. He canceled meetings without being prompted, skipped events that used to define his schedule. The penthouse felt different now, not because of furniture or lighting, but because it was no longer designed around his ego. It was becoming a place someone else could breathe in. Then, on a rainy evening, something changed. Erin had been distant that day, more than usual. She hadn't touched her breakfast, spent hours in the guest room with the door closed. Reed didn't ask. He waited. When she finally stepped into the living room, her face was unreadable, her voice soft. "There's something I haven't told you." He braced for impact. He always did. She sat down, folded her hands, and told him about the pregnancy. Not a theory, not a dream, a real child, lost. Not to accident, but to grief. The fallout of his choices hadn't just ended a business. It had taken her future. Her body had carried the burden of his destruction long before they'd ever met. Reed didn't interrupt. He didn't breathe. She told him the timeline, the hospital visit, the silence she kept for years, because no one would have understood, because no one cared, because the world had always treated men like Reed as visionaries, not wrecking balls. He felt the weight drop inside him like a stone into water, displacing everything. She didn't cry. She didn't accuse. She just told him the truth. And then she waited. He whispered that he didn't know, that he couldn't have imagined, that he would have done anything to undo it. She shook her head. "That's the point," she said. "You didn't imagine. You never even looked." And in that moment, Reed realized this had never been about revenge. It had been about recognition, about forcing him to see what his success had cost other people, people without voices loud enough to reach him through all his noise. She stood, told him she didn't know if she'd ever forgive him, but she could see he was trying. And that mattered. Not enough to erase the past, but enough to make her consider a different kind of future. In the days that followed, they shared more space, still careful, still quiet, but the wall between them began to dissolve in inches. Reed started doing more than just staying present. He began to repair what he could, outside the penthouse. He tracked down families he'd affected, sat in modest living rooms and admitted the truth. He didn't use lawyers. He didn't send representatives. He showed up. And when they asked why, he didn't offer excuses. He offered time, money, structure, real solutions, not guilt payments, commitment. Some refused, some accepted. None of it erased what had been done. But it became a ledger he could finally start balancing, not for redemption, but responsibility. Erin watched it all from a distance. She didn't praise him. She didn't challenge him. She observed, and slowly something in her gaze changed, not softened, but shifted. There was acknowledgement now, respect, maybe, or the beginning of it. Then came the 6-month mark. The contract's end, the original bet. There was no ceremony, no fireworks, just a quiet dinner at home. Reed made pasta. Erin chose the wine. They didn't say anything about the date, didn't mention the money, didn't toast to anything. After the dishes were cleared, Reed turned to her, his voice low. I know what this started as, but I don't want it to end that way. She looked at him, said nothing. I want to stay, he continued, but only if we start over. No conditions, no games. Erin didn't answer right away. She stood, walked to the window, watched the city breathe beneath them. Then she turned, slowly. I want something real, she said. Not perfect, not clean, but honest. He nodded. No speech, no promises. They started again, not with rings or declarations, but with mornings that didn't feel tense, with meals shared out of habit, not obligation, with slow laughter that returned like a forgotten song. They didn't call it love. Not yet, but something lived there. Something that didn't exist when they signed that marriage license. Then one morning, Erin stood in the bathroom, holding a test in her hand. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She just waited. And when Reed entered the room, she handed it to him. No words, just truth. He looked at it, then looked at her. I want to do this right, he said. She nodded. This time she believed him. They didn't throw a wedding. They planned a life, slowly, deliberately. They sold the penthouse, moved to a place that didn't echo like memory. Reed continued his work, quietly, steadily. Not to erase the past, but to build a new one. They didn't pretend everything was okay. They carried the weight together, some days heavier than others, some nights darker than most. But they moved forward. And sometimes when Erin looked at him, she didn't see the man who broke everything. She saw the man who chose to rebuild, knowing he might never be forgiven. Some stories aren't about heroes or villains. They're about people who learn too late, then choose to do better anyway. That doesn't make them saints. It makes them human. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to today's story. We truly appreciate your presence and the moments you've shared with us. This wasn't just a story about two people. It was a journey about loss, awareness, and the courage to change. It reminds us that redemption doesn't always come wrapped in forgiveness. Sometimes it comes in the form of quiet effort, of showing up when it's hard, of choosing to be better, even when no one's watching. If this story touched something in you, helped you reflect, or simply gave you a new perspective, we're grateful. To support our channel, all you need to do is hit the like button. Leave us a comment to let us know what country you're watching from and how this story made you feel. And of course, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future stories. Every like, every comment, and every new subscriber gives us the motivation to keep telling meaningful stories like this one. Thank you again for being here.